Let me walk you guys through this first set of slides here. This first presentation covers roughly 3 periods of time. It's been simplified down quite a bit, and we're going to start out with the Paleolithic era. There's a lot of information about this typed on Blackboard, and I believe there's a video that's already available that's probably better than this one, but I'm just filling in the gaps here. I like starting with this particular image because it gives you a lot of context about the interests and focus of what we as a human animal were dealing with at the time. What I like to draw people's attention to first is the fact that this horse has been painted on this specific rock inside of a cave. And the reason being is that the natural curvature of the rock here already provides the shape of the head of the horse. This sort of leads to the explanation that the people who were primarily painting these cave paintings were the shamanistic members of society. They were the medicine men. A lot of people believe now that they were people who were uh, entering altered states of consciousness, either through meditation or through hallucinogens or something like that. But they would walk through the caves and they would wait for the shadows in the cave or the way that the light of their torch danced off the walls of the cave to provide them with an indication of what it is that they should be drawing forth. And in this particular rock was providing somebody with a horse. Now, the other interesting part of this is this handprint right directly over top the horse, and that handprint is essentially a signature. How do they make the handprint? Well, that's also a pretty interesting process. They would use carbon, charcoal probably from the fires that they had. They would chew up the charcoal in their mouths usually and mix it with animal fat. Then they would blow that through a hollow reed like spray paint until it would make a negative imprint of their hand. The lines that create the curvature of the horse itself was probably done using a brush that was made of animal hair, but the pigmentation, the animal fat were probably the same. Now, people look at these cave paintings, and from a formal standpoint, there's really not a whole lot to work with. They're not really all that impressive. They're fairly simple, but that doesn't mean that they're primitive. It just means that this is a stylistic preference. I'll show you a slide in a minute that'll give you a little bit more proof that this was just what it was that they wanted their images to look like. In fact, if you ever try to draw, the shape of a horse using one continuous line, you'd probably find out pretty quick that it's a pretty difficult thing to do in itself. It's not that they were incapable or that it was just the only thing that they were able to do. It was a stylistic preference. That being said, stylistic preferences change. There are different versions of these paintings, and even the motivations to say like the supernatural drawing forth of the spirits of the animal. That's one explanation. The astrological signs, the placement of the stars in the sky could be another explanation, but to say that there's only one reason that people made art back then is just as ridiculous as saying that there's one reason why people make art today. There's a lot of flexibility there. So here's a map of prehistoric Europe. If you look at this really closely, you'll see these little red dots. These little red dots denote areas where that we have found proof of settlement, and this is a very simplified version. There's all over Europe. There's proof of human existence during the Paleolithic era. The geography is predominantly limestone, it's a soft stone, which leads to a lot of erosion. When it rains heavily in areas, there's a lot of washout, and you get long networks of caves. And these cave networks had Homo sapiens living in them for tens of thousands of years. So the ones that have dots here aren't the only cave networks or whatever that had people living in them. Those are just the ones that were, for some reason or another, sealed off or preserved well enough for us to be able to discover something about it archaeologically. So next. All right, the woman from Willendorf. This was originally called the Venus of Willendorf, but then, just for political purposes, it's being called the Woman of Willendorf now. Um, Take a second and just guess what this might have been used for. So if you were thinking fertility idol, then you're right. You can tell that because of the exaggerated elements of the figure. All of the primary and secondary sex organs have been exaggerated. And what's more interesting than that to me are the elements of the female figure that have been negated. Notice that these described as having pendulous breasts and an expansive midsection. I think this is explained a little bit more on Blackboard. I type it out. Like they hadn't really made the connection between uh, sexual activity and birth. It was just sort of this magical process. And during this time period, it was so important to have numbers in your tribes that birth was a significant part of that process. And if you really relied on having numbers, but you didn't really feel like you understood the process of making those numbers, then that's really how superstitions developed, and that's kind of what this was. It's an early form of a religion, but really it's more superstitious than anything else. So the lack of a face, the fact that there are no arms here, like that's the arms are here, but they barely exist at all. There are no feet. I don't know if they were there and they broke off, but um, these were not the parts that were necessary for making babies. So at the time, a lot of culture sort of saw women as baby factories. Um, yeah, just not the best times. A lot of the curvature of the rock is naturally occurring. So somebody was probably walking along, they saw this rock laying on the ground, they picked it up, and they're like, "Hey, how about this rock, huh?" And they took it back to wherever it is that they had settled, and then they did a lot of the inscribing of details and this pock marking around where the face should be, and they defined it. And then at one point in time, it was painted with this natural like iron oxide, this umbered color paint. And but it was small. Let's see, it's 4 and 3/8 inches tall, just a little bit short than 4.5 inches. So it was portable. Paleolithic society, they were nomadic hunter-gatherers, so everything that they had that was of value, they had to be able to take it with them. This is just a really good evidence of that. So this is one of those cave networks. I like that there's a guy standing in here because it gives you a reference to scale. But notice how these caves are just covered with animals, and these paintings were done over periods of tens of thousands of years, just different generations of people occupying the same caves. We'll just skip that one. Same thing here. You can tell that just like that horse-headed rock, somebody saw these outcroppings and they thought that those outcroppings apparently resembled a herd of buffalo or bison, and that's what they decided they were going to paint. Now, this is the slide that gives you a little bit more proof that the fact that they were painting these really simplistic, stylized animals doesn't mean that that was all they were capable of doing. You can see here, this is clay that's been mushed up into the form of well, at least two bison, and there's a lot of fine detail here. Now, the people who did this, the cave dwelling people, were the men were the hunters, the women typically did the gathering, and the children hung out with the women and probably made little clay sculptures when they were not doing anything else. It was just one of those things that they would do to like as a game, just to play. So this was probably done by children. Now, what you see here is completely different than any of the other slides that we've seen before because this is a man-made structure. Be sure to watch the video about the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic culture. We're skipping the Mesolithic just for the sake of simplicity here, but just see how everything that you see, these are rocks that are just stacked on top of each other. That's what's called megalithic structures. Megalithic architecture, mega means big, and lith, L-I-T-H, just means stone. So anytime you have a structure that is just a bunch of big stones stacked on top of each other with no joinery, with no mortar or cement to keep them together, then it's just a megalithic structure. Now, right here, this thing looks kind of like an entertainment unit or something. If we were to take the center post out of that, then what we would have is two vertical posts spanned by a long horizontal post, and that is a post and lintel. Now, post and lintel is the most simplistic form of megalithic architecture. If you're missing either a post or a lintel here, then all you have is two rocks. And this is the very basic form of megalithic architecture. So Stonehenge, there's a video about that on Blackboard too. If you're particularly interested in Stonehenge, then check that out. This is a good example of a post and lintel structure. Um, as are I believe the pyramids are also megalithic. Um, Rocks stacked. I'm not sure if there's more to holding them all of them together or not, but um, I typically don't get too hung up on Stonehenge because some of the pyramids actually predate what's happening here and is much, much more impressive. Anyway, yeah, check out the video about that. Now, this is really the third large chunk of time. And again, I'm simplifying this quite a bit, but we've gone through the Paleolithic era where we had the nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then we had your Neolithic culture. Let's go back a little bit. I don't think I explained that well enough. Neolithic culture it revolved around year-round settlements. Agriculture and domesticated livestock allowed human beings to be able to stay in one place all year round and not starve to death. Um, it was a really big technological leap forward, but that's what defines Neolithic culture. And once we were able to settle down in one location, we were able to develop specific jobs, which allowed us to become good at very specific tasks. We became really good at farming very quickly, um, really good at making weaponry, but that became a lot more prevalent when we got to this point. And this is just significant because it represents the Metal Ages. This, I believe, is bronze. It's a bronze, and this is gold plated. It's supposed to depict the chariot of Apollo, which was responsible for theoretically pulling the sun across the sky throughout the course of the day. But the fact that this is actually as a small, medium-sized metal sculpture is what's most interesting to me. Um, we got really good at developing metallurgy very quickly. Um, Odds are it was a technology that was developed accidentally. We were developing ceramics as soon as we had settled into our year-round settlements. Like once we had a place to stay all year round, we had to have a means of storing food all year round, and that's where ceramics came in. Ceramics are essentially it's baked clay, and that baked clay can be treated with what's called a slip, which is it's almost like really thin, sandy water. Um, I'm sure people who know more about ceramics could explain this a lot better than me. But once it gets to a certain temperature, the silica in the sand melts and essentially creates this thin layer of what's basically glass across the surface or interior of the vessel, which then makes it watertight. Grain is basically eternal if it's kept away from moisture, and that's essentially what they were relying on. Now, to get the fires in those kilns hot enough to create that slip, and we're talking at well over 1,000 degrees. And at some point in time, it's assumed that the silica that they were looking for became scarce, so they were mixing together different ores, different metal ores that they could find near where they were at. And at some point in time, they got the right metals in the right proportions, and that's essentially where they developed metallurgy. It's just those specific ores at the right temperature mixed together, and they essentially smelted them. So the Bronze Age was first, which gave way to the Iron Age and then the Copper Age. But what's most important to note is that as soon as we started to work with metal, we developed weaponry and we developed very specific tools for farming and other jobs. So this was another very huge technological leap forward. It's hard to think about, agriculture as being a technology and domesticated livestock as being a technology, but they definitely were. It really changed the way that we interacted with the world around us and gave us a certain element of control. The civilizations that got control of metallurgy, the ones who perfected it first, immediately had a huge advantage over all of the civilizations that were around them. It was definitely a huge leg up. So there's some of the detail in that. All right.